By way of preface, I want to mention what I consider to be two important reasons why we are here today or this evening. And there are two of them. Number one, there's been a recent new intensification of a false cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. And the second reason is because of the 2017 deadline for the release of all remaining secret records, including those records released but with redactions, related to the death of President Kennedy 5 decades ago. The cover-up of the truth, the real cover-up of the truth about the assassination of the president had already been put in motion in the months before his death. That cover-up was then further embellished during the 2 decades that followed. Now it has recently, just 2 years ago in the spring of 2013, been maliciously expanded and intensified. The malevolent character of this new present stage of the cover-up cannot be overstated. It holds that, yes, indeed, there was a cover-up of the truth. But its perpetrators of this new round of the campaign are feeding us salacious propaganda. They want you to believe that the prime movers behind this so-called cover-up were President Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, and United States Chief Justice Earl Warren. President Johnson ordered Warren to direct the commission that conducted the investigation into the assassination. Warren refused, and I'll be telling you some details of how President Johnson browbeat him and cowed him into taking the task. The true nature of the cover-up, however, was a psychological warfare and propaganda operation. And it was all about Fidel Castro. The cover-up was designed to prevent an investigation of who really was behind the plot. I'll go into some of the details of how the real cover-up was put into place shortly when I lay out for you the main hypotheses and assumptions that are going to be guiding the series of volumes that of my investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And perhaps if somebody will pose a question in the Q&A, I'll share with you some of the details of who is behind the 2013 resurgence of the Castro killed Kennedy psych warfare operation. But now I want to be clear about this point. This new offensive to further exaggerate the false cover-up scenario and the placing of the blame for the death of JFK at the feet of his brother, Robert Kennedy, is one of the motivating factors driving my work now on this case, and a principal reason I've come to Allegheny College to speak with you this evening about it. But there's another reason also why we are here this evening and should be here, and it has motivated me to work very hard to identify the true names of intelligence officers operating behind false names, pseudonyms, and to identify their activities and operations masked by what we call cryptonyms, which are random short letter number combinations. I'll talk more about this point shortly, but there's another point I want to make clear. My work and the work of other researchers, Joe Bacchus came a long way. Here's another person who's been very important in pushing these types of identifications and getting things out. The work of these people, these identifications, is part of a campaign, more than a movement, a campaign now, in the most important battle we've ever had to face to get to the truth about the assassination of President Kennedy. It's a fight to ensure, as is now required by law, that all the remaining secret records on the case must be released just 2 years from now, in October 2017. This battle involves you. It involves all of us, and I have more to say about that tonight. When I get to the end of my formal remarks, I want to talk to you more about 2017 and what that means. We have a brand new website ready to go on that, and I'd like to talk to you about that. I would like to start with a brief prologue. I call it Dark Operations, and by way of introducing this concept, I want to talk to you briefly about the founding fathers of our republic and a few things they said about things being dark, government information not being available. Here's the first comment. a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. James Madison, 1782. Second comment. The right of freely examining public characters and measures and of communication among the people thereon has ever been justly deemed the only effectual guardian of every other right. Again, James Madison, 1798. And a final thought. A fondness for power is implanted in most men, and it is natural to abuse it when acquired. This maxim, drawn from the experience of all ages, makes it the height of folly to entrust any set of men with power which is not under every possible control. Alexander Hamilton, 1775, and I could go on. Jefferson and George Washington and many others were warning us about the unbridled secrecy of government. These trenchant thoughts of our founding fathers inform us today about how we should approach learning from our recent past. This is especially true with regard to the American failure in Cuba and the history of the Cold War. The lessons of these events cannot be ascertained from the study of publicly released State Department and White House records alone. Access to those documents is undeniably important. Yet, we also need access to the CIA, FBI, and military records that are still being withheld behind the wall of official secrecy. These records should have been released a long time ago. Physicists need access to information about what they now call dark energy and dark matter. Together, they account for 96% of the universe. Without this information, physicists cannot understand how visible matter behaves. Similarly, and all too often in our society, what lies behind that wall of secrecy is information connected to the dark dimension of political, military, and economic power. Lack of access to this information distorts our understanding of what is taking place in our world, and this makes us more vulnerable to manipulation. The dark contours of our society are formed by the nexus of political, economic, and military interests in which shifting alliances of individuals who have personal stakes in the outcome determine how events play out. And although the details about these interests and alliances are unseen, they shape, alter, and even undermine presidential policy and larger American interests. They are not unlike black holes. They cause the normal laws of social order to break down. They can be so weighty they curve the political and economic paths of our history and our destiny. Presidents are no more immune to manipulation than the common man on the street. In fact, the power of the presidency renders the person wielding it even more vulnerable. Let me illustrate that statement by sharing with you the troubling experiences of Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy on the Cuban situation. In the discussion of the unanticipated and dramatic American failure of Cuba in 1958, in Chapter 1 of Where Angels Tread Lightly, we can now understand how President Eisenhower was kept in the dark about matters that he should not have been. He was told no more than what a few senior officers of the government, particularly from the CIA, decided that he should know about Castro and communism. He was very upset when he found out that during Castro's final drive for power, what Eisenhower called the main elements of the Cuban situation had been withheld from him. President Kennedy found himself on the horns of exactly the same embarrassing dilemma in Cuba just 2 years later. He, too, was kept in the dark about important information. As the moment for the planned Bay of Pigs invasion approached, the CIA was not as forthright as it should have been with the president about the long odds for the success of that operation. So I would like to add the term dark operations to our vocabulary. What I mean by that term is this. Under many of the CIA's already secret operations, there was another operation in play. How did they succeed in keeping these super sensitive operations so dark? They did it by disconnecting and fragmenting them, by a complete breaking down of the record of these operations. The shattered bits and fragments of data were then permitted to flow along separate trajectories and end up in disconnected and unrecognizable compartments. The CIA's cryptonyms and pseudonyms function like the atom smashers of subatomic physics. CIA operatives use pseudonyms, false names, when they handle their sources. The agency also uses cryptonyms, these letter-number combinations, for people and for operations. The original intended use of these methods was not just to keep the American public in the dark. The CIA pseudonyms and cryptonyms have been and still are used secretly at the internal level. The internal use of cryptonyms and pseudonyms was designed to protect CIA operations. Their use makes it difficult for penetrators and moles to piece together sensitive operations generally. It is the foundation of what is called compartmentalization and the need to know. However, keeping cryptonyms and pseudonyms secret forever is unnecessary, and it can even be harmful. It can undermine the faith of the people in their institutions of government, especially if something has gone wrong with intelligence operations. And something did go terribly wrong with American intelligence operations before, during, and after the assassination of President Kennedy. There is no darker story in our recent history than how the American struggle with Fidel Castro became entangled with the assassination of President Kennedy. I am not arguing that this necessarily involved a lot of people in the CIA, the FBI, or in the other U.S. national security organizations. But I am arguing that without unmasking the CIA pseudonyms and cryptonyms and multiple identities that were in use over half a century ago and were related to this case, it will not be possible for us to find out, let alone prove beyond a doubt, who was behind the assassination in Dealey Plaza and how they got away with it. As the words of our founding fathers often remind us, we have not only the right to find out, we have the duty to find out. The president's murder happened 51 years ago, and the CIA's continued withholding of records is still being justified based on the flawed premise that it is protecting sources and methods from foreign intelligence services. Those sources and methods have been known around the world for decades. This justification lacks credibility today. The continued withholding of these records now functions only to hide the record of these operations from those to whom they really belong, the American public. And our Congress agrees, and that is why they passed the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act in 1992. And I'll get back to this point in the battle for 2017 at the end of my formal remarks.